And if I can find... Okay, so this is me here, upgrading my cognitive abilities, upgrading my memory, which badly needs to be upgraded, upgrading my capacity to deal in financial affairs because it's pretty much non-existent. So where we've got to is a sense of the plasticity, the pliability of definitions of the biological human, telescoped down into the moral considerability of persons, which are only some humans, well actually most humans, but some humans are left out. And then of course law plays pretty much a passive role in all of this. It simply reflects and embeds all of those preferences that have accumulated over probably centuries. And we did note the clear bias within ethics, and all the more so within law, in favor of some concept that the entity in question is capable of self-awareness, can stand outside itself and look back at itself, is capable of projecting itself into the future, and has a certain level of cognitive ability, rational ability to enable it to navigate the life world, even though the World Bank tells us that most of the time, most of us operate automatically, taking in social cues and mental cues and so forth. So now we're to the next phase. We looked at some of the boundary issues between human and person, and then whether persons with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, severe intellectual disabilities are persons, and then whether some other sentient beings like animals could in fact be persons if they are close enough to those core indicators like self-consciousness, self-awareness, and a certain level of rational ability. What this never contemplated was that the human person biologically could transcend itself, could expand itself beyond its traditional domain. And that's what Yuval Harari says. We're now really at an inflection point whereby it's no longer just a case of using science and technology to control nature. It's now more a case of using science and technology to change our nature, hopefully for the better, but you can see some of the military applications immediately, sometimes for the worse, okay? So the nice thing about Michael Bess is that he puts together a kind of a survey of the technology. Now it's not complete, it's not wholly scientific, but at least it gives you a snapshot view of the way things are bubbling up. And somebody said to me on the way into class a few minutes ago that we don't look at this in India. Well, you better, because you have one of the biggest biopharma industries in the world, and your scientists, I bet you, are participating in a lot of these projects. And if India wants to become a hub, it's going to have to somehow rationalize, legitimate, and perhaps place some regulatory boundaries around the evolution of this science. It isn't just India, it's everywhere in the world. There's very much a lacuna or a major gap in legal regulation of this emerging field, which means there's big dollars in it for you as lawyers into the future, but hopefully also fulfilling careers if that's what you wish to pursue. So I just thought I'd throw up a provocative image there of the human being being transformed through various technologies and so forth. Michael Bess has his own website, and he mentioned that, I think, in the introduction to the book, and it's called Our Grandchildren Redesigned. Very provocative, right? And when you visit the website under, for example, Science Technology Updates, you'll get briefings on how the science is evolving, how it's emerging, what kind of projects are being funded, and they're funded mostly by capital venture funds who see a growing market here, and partly by government research programs to try and, as it were, build up their research capacity to be able to attract even more industries into their country and so forth. I'm not sure whether India is doing that, but certainly the United States and the European Union are doing that. And you may have seen that the European Union 6-7 years ago poured something like 8 billion euros into a huge project called the Mind Project in the European Union. The Americans followed suit 3 or 4 years later with a similar project in the United States on the science of the mind. And what they wanted to do was replicate the success of the 1990s program on the Human Genome Project, which was a project to ultimately map every aspect of the human genome and then take it from there, so to speak. So what they're doing is they said, job done with respect to the human genome. Now, let's move on to the hard bit, which is the mind, which is infinitely actually more complex than mapping the human genome. So anyhow, that's his website, a very provocative title, Our Grandchildren Redesigned. And you'll get quite a bit of interesting stuff on there. By the way, there's a special issue of Foreign Policy. You know, that eminent journal in the United States, people like Kennan and the gurus in foreign policy write in it, Kissinger and others. Well, recently they had an issue on what are the big challenges into the next century. And Francis Fukuyama, who is otherwise known as the author of the idea that history is dead after the Iron Curtain fell, which has turned out not to be true, spectacularly so, has written a piece on, from his point of view, the biggest threat into this century is transhumanism. The idea that we can play God with who the human being is and leave it willy-nilly and be reckless. I mean, venture funds, but particularly vulture funds, are highly reckless. So they're not too concerned about what the implications will be 3 generations down the line. They're just interested in, can they make a quick buck and can they distribute it to their shareholders in the immediate term and not the long term. In any event, and 5 or 6 other people highlighted other huge problems in the world. I think the environment figured very, very, very prominently as one of these problems. But it's interesting that he selected transhumanism as the biggest threat to humanity in the 21st century. Anyhow, I just thought I'd show you that website in case you want to visit it some more. So, as you've seen, what Michael Best does is he goes through the various scientific domains to give you a snapshot picture of what's happening, both with respect to pharmaceutical industry, bioelectronics, genetics, the really interesting one, and that's where the Nuffield Council on Bioethics has just done a major publication. And then through other forms of technology, but particularly nanotechnology, which is quite scary actually when you look at it, but quite amazing at the same time. Pharma is pretty straightforward. We've always sought to improve our appearance through various means, and now it's been taken to another stage in terms of, for example, if you suffer hair loss, you can get a drug that will fix that, or at least ameliorate it. If you have wrinkles, I don't personally see the problem with wrinkles because that's natural in aging, but if you have, there's anti-wrinkle pharmaceutical products available. If you are fat and you want to grow thin, there's supplements, pharmaceutical drugs that you can take, and so on and so forth. So that's probably the least of our concerns, at least at this point in time. The interesting thing is you can also produce drugs that, to a certain extent at least, enhance cognitive ability, right? I think you were telling me about Red Bull as an interesting non-pharmaceutical intervention to try and, short-term at least, boost your energy. And I told you about certain drugs that the military take before they go into action that enable them to not sleep for 4 days on the run, which apparently gives them an advantage. But if the other guys are not sleeping for 4 days on the run, that kind of wipes out the advantage, right? And in terms of really having a handle over the enhancement of cognitive ability, we're talking about advances in nanotechnology, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it is possible, to a certain extent, to enhance your cognitive ability, at least for limited periods of time. Somebody was telling me there's a drug you can take, a pill you can take, let's say a few days before an examination to make sure you're on tip-top shape for the actual examination. I would not encourage it, but it is probably out there. This is a really interesting one. What if you're a wife and your husband's complaining all the time about the tidiness of the house or the meals that you cook? Wouldn't you like to edit that out of his emotional makeup, right? Wouldn't it make for a lot more domestic harmony if you could do that? And vice versa, and pick the topic, okay? And the thing is, you can do it. There are pharmaceutical products coming on the market that has this impact, that can make you happier, right? And people are saying we shouldn't be measuring the progress of nation states in terms of GDP. We should be measuring it in terms of a human happiness index. Apparently, if I remember correctly, Nepal scores extremely high on the human happiness index. Might not score very high on GDP, but it certainly outranks countries like Switzerland on the human happiness index. So why wouldn't you want to take that? Or if you're a poet, right? Sylvia Plath, I won't say notorious, but a great poet, right? I love her poetry. I have a lawyer's attitude to poetry, which is that, why don't you give it to me in bullet points, then I'll understand it, okay? But if you really wanted to become like Sylvia Plath, why not take a drug that makes you depressed? And depression might induce some really insightful poetry and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily just happiness or augmenting positive traits. It could also mean the reverse if it was useful or functional to you at a particular point in time. And then the last one, shucks. Recently, if you've seen in the newspapers, they've said, we've reached the limit. And the limit is something like 90 whatever. The scientists are now concluding that we've reached the natural limit of how far we can push human longevity. Of course, you have many, well, not many, but some who overreach 100, but that's still statistically insignificant. By the way, very interesting statistic. They're saying that in 10 years' time, there will be more people over 80 in the UK than under 18. Quite a huge demographic shift with very big political and economic implications. Anyhow, I was saying to you that some of the genetic scientists in particular have identified the gene that turns off the process for maintaining at an optimum state many of your organs. They say in your late 20s, early 30s, your organs begin to close down one by one. I should be dead by now. And that if you could somehow or other interfere with that genetic triggering mechanism, you might extend longevity up to age 150, 160, and who knows thereafter, okay? Does everybody know the Grey Panthers in the United States? There was a black rights movement formed in the 60s called the Black Panthers, and in the 1970s, 1980s, older persons groups came together and formed the Grey Panthers to advocate for the rights of older people. Parenthesis here, there is actually at the moment an ongoing process in the UN to draft a treaty on the rights of older people. Close the parenthesis. If anybody wants to look at it, just Google the UN Open-Ended Working Group on the Rights of Older People. I know it's not on point, but I thought maybe you'd be interested to know it. So just going back, that's basically what he says about the pharma industry. And when you see pharma industry, you see big bucks. A lot of money going into this. What they're aiming at is a new consumer market that doesn't yet exist, right? So they're all positioning themselves to capture market share into the future. And they'll all be consulting you as lawyers in order to enable them to do that, okay? Okay, so then he surveys bioelectronics and gives many kind of pithy examples of where the application of bioelectronics is producing tantalizing results. They're not yet results that we can replicate across the field. They're not yet universally available, but they're telling us what's possible. And that's quite fascinating. Restoring senses and perhaps even extending senses. Being able to experience different things that are beyond the range of species typical functioning for a human. Tell you a very interesting thing. What color is this chair here? Red. It's not. Pardon? Okay, let's say it's maroon, right? Do we have a consensus it's maroon? It's not. It doesn't occur in nature as maroon. The way your receptors interpret ultraviolet light makes it and labels it maroon in your mind and in your brain. It does not objectively exist as a maroon entity, okay? And that explains why dogs don't see color. Their receptors are not as developed as ours, and they only see variations of black and white. So what these guys are saying is that there are other things that we can sense beyond our five senses that we yet haven't done so, and perhaps would be able to do so in the future. The example they gave was a sense of situational place, that you can detect, like some animals do, the magnetic fields of the earth, and that would become a sixth sense that you would be able to navigate without even looking at a sat nav in your car or something like that. So that's absolutely fascinating. It kind of spooky as well. It kind of suggests, maybe there are aliens with different sets of senses to us, and maybe we can replicate what their senses are into the future. That's very, very hypothetical. This is another interesting one, that with certain electromagnetic skull caps, for example, that are non-invasive, non-intrusive technology, that the patterns, the firing of the neurons in our mind, which reflect our own preferences, can be interpreted and applied remotely, interpreted by some sort of processing machine, and then instructions sent remotely to a machine that exists elsewhere. For example, the famous experiment of the guy in Germany with the skull cap, with a bionic arm several feet away. He could twitch the fingers, move the elbow, and so on and so forth. Now, you see immediately the military implications, right? Today, we have people in Western United States in a cabin flying a drone in Afghanistan and whatever, but you won't even need to have that technology if we can migrate toward this kind of technology. So they're thinking of, let's say, mining on the moon using remote machines that are controlled by human beings, experiencing interstellar flight without actually being present on the spacecraft. They're not talking about 10 years' time here. They're talking about 20, 30, 40 years' time, but well, a lot of money is being put into the technology. So first application probably military, second application probably games or something like that, which I don't understand computer games. I don't know why people are so hung up on it. Thirdly, using the bioelectronics to restore memory and cognition. Huge dollars here because of one thing, and that's what's the term I'm looking for older people? What's the disease that they all get? Sorry. Alzheimer's, exactly. What Alzheimer's does is it degrades the neural connections, because it's not as if things are stored in our brain. It's that particular connections represent particular things to us. But they get heavily degraded in people with Alzheimer's, and to a certain extent they can be stitched back together, not completely. So I guess the primary application here would be to prevent the degradation of the actual neural networks and to repair them where possible, and so on and so forth. So imagine if we could prevent Alzheimer's, the onset of Alzheimer's. And by the way, Alzheimer's isn't just a disease of older people. Younger people can get it as well. Not so many, but some do, unfortunately. Third application would be monitoring the mind. You have the skull cap on. It tracks your thoughts, although they can't actually quite define what a thought is. That's fascinating. So some of the applications are kind of ahead of the basic scientific understanding, but I'm sure they'll get there at some stage. So we can, and the experiment was a cat, who was presented with the word neuron spelt out in black and white. And so the relevant electrodes were planted in the relevant part of the cat's brain. It picked up the neural signals that she was experiencing, and then it, as it were, translated that into something that could be read on a computer, and lo and behold, it represented more or less the words N-E-U-R-O-N, okay? So we're getting closer to being able to track human minds. Now that should scare the wits out of you, right? Because think of all the malevolent applications that could bring forth in terms of crowd control, thought control. Again, we're back to the old nightmare of East Germany, socialist man fabricating who is socially acceptable and who is not, and so forth. What they're saying is that, quite apart from those political problems, right, it's then another step, and a logical step, to not just tracking you day to day, but altering your behavior. Maybe auto-suggesting to you that, no, you shouldn't eat that dosa, it'll put on too many calories or whatever. You should go back to the library and read your books, or something like that. Or you shouldn't associate with that group of people, you should associate with this group of people, and so on and so forth. So, very, very interesting. It's more the non-intrusive applications that are likely to grow into the future, but already there's huge industry involvement in all of this, okay? Very straightforward, and you've seen it in BESS. So, yeah, that's just really saying the same thing. These are really the outputs, or this is where the science is tending in toward of bioelectronics. Very, very exciting field if you're a scientist, but quite scary for a lot of other people. Genetics, and we're back to our old friend Charles Darwin. I often think we should have a course on Darwin and the law. I think that would be an absolutely fascinating course, and I can even imagine how you'd try and build it. So the interesting thing about Darwin, again I told you, is that he was a little bit frightened about his own thesis and what it might lead to. And one thing it led to was eugenics. I guess the impulse to separate out people was there from time immemorial, but at least now they had a scientific rationale available for it. And there's no, nothing fancy to this. We separate out what's called negative eugenics from positive eugenics. Negative eugenics meaning that we disincentivize, we even disallow by law certain categories of people from intermarrying or having sexual relations or reproducing, and therefore continuing to degrade the stock, right? That's the theory. So you have lots of laws in the United States, for example, going back 150 years, thankfully now off the books because of the Supreme Court, saying that black people could not marry white people. You had laws in Nazi Germany in the 1930s saying Germans could not marry Jews, and couldn't fraternize with Jews, and so on and so forth. Then we have what's called positive eugenics, which is basically nudging people. Maybe that's a signal for positive eugenics, I don't know. Incentivizing people to get married with, to have sexual relations with people of like stock in order to consolidate and improve the stock. And there's a great book produced by, I think it's Longridge is his name, in Oxford, on Heinrich Himmler. It's about 1,000 pages long, but I guarantee you if you pick it up, you will not be able to leave it down. And one of the things about Himmler is, and I told you he was a chicken farmer who was used to very crude ideas of improving his stock of chickens, right through interbreeding and so forth. But also in the SS, which he established, he gave the SS officers the right to conduct extramarital affairs with German women, provided they produced good Aryan stock. A very notorious policy on behalf of Himmler, but that was basically the idea. And you can see how, if you're of the mind of someone like Himmler, how it's such a short step to not just tolerating the poorer stock at the margins of society, but heck, if they have no genetic future at all, just kill them off, okay? Treat them as non-persons. And the German term was Untermensch, under the level of being a human, okay? And I might show you in a few minutes, if we have time, a short video on eugenics, but let's see how we do. So, I just thought I'd show you this. One of the interesting things about genetic science is we're finally understanding where we've come from. And there's some websites out there that give you maps of genetic flows of peoples through time. In other words, particular identifiable genetic pools can be traced, and the inputs to those pools from other pools can also be traced. And you can even work it out geographically. Where did the Irish come from? Where did the Indians come from? And so forth. This is just one, and it's hosted by University College London, obviously in London. And just to make it even plainer, here's a picture of India with sort of population flows in and out. What's fascinating to me is that the population flow of Jewish people to India over time, which I never realized, but you do realize when you look at maps like this. They say they're very accurate. I'm not sure myself. The one on Ireland is quite fascinating as well. It shows a lot of Scandinavian influences, which means one thing: the Vikings. And in actual fact, if you go to Iceland, there's an island just south of Iceland, a very small island, where pretty much everybody has red hair. And the folklore has it that that's where the Vikings brought all of their Irish slaves and dumped them in the island once they were done with them. So anyhow, if you go onto that website, you'll see population flows from a genetic point of view. One thing that's coming out of the genetics is just information, right? You can go to a supermarket in the US today and get a genetic testing pack, right? And that will reveal to you your genetic predispositions. You might have a genetic predisposition to a certain form of cancer, or you might have a genetic predisposition to tolerate stress. And this is causing interesting issues in the insurance industry, because, as you know, the basis of insurance is the doctrine of uberrima fides. You must tell the would-be insurer everything you know about all of your conditions and your preconditions and so forth. And so if you had a serious illness 3 years ago, you must say it. But that's something you know about. Prior to a few years ago, you would not have been able to know about your genetic makeup and your genetic predispositions, right? So now you do. Now you have access to that, and then all things being equal, all of those genetic predispositions should be informed to the insurance company. And not just insurance companies. Think about this from a rational point of view. If you have a university, gee, I'm being genetically tested a lot today. If you have a university with scarce places for medicine that cost the government $12,000 a year, $20,000 a year, who are you going to give the place to? You're not going to give the place to somebody who's prone to die in 10 years' time, right? You're going to give the place to somebody who will be productive in your society for the next 30 or 40 years. So lots of entities have objectively rational interests in obtaining the information. But see what happens if that happens. You end up with a gradated or a concentric circle of the genetically included and the genetically excluded. From pathways into the life world like education, from employment, especially from employment. Why the hell would I take you on if I know you're going to die in 5 years, right? So that's why the US enacted the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. Somebody mentioned it 1 or 2 or 3 days ago. And this is it's a classic lower reform measure that doesn't deal with a specific problem because the science was still in its infancy, but it acts as a prophylactic to prohibit certain problems arising into the future. And that was one of the debates, because the industry was saying, well, there's no evidence that this information would be used poorly, whereas Congress, even in a Republican administration, was convinced that the dangers of it being used negatively were so great that we got to regulate for it. Okay? Now, this is the only piece of legislation in the world that does that. I don't know about you, but under European law, medical testing to become an employee is not regulated. So the employer can go on a fishing expedition to try and find out what are your genetic predispositions. The employer is not confined to an inquiry into what predisposition is relevant to successful execution of the job. They can actually go on fishing expeditions. I'm not sure what Indian employment law is like, or Indian non-discrimination law, but that's a huge gap in our law. And about 2 years ago, we produced a book trying to build on the American example to say we needed to actually have similar legislation in the European Union. So we tried to build a case for a European Union legal response and got a great response from the European Parliament. But the Parliament went for re-election, so I'm not quite sure where the agenda is yet. So it's by Rutledge, Genetic Discrimination, Transatlantic Perspectives on the case for a European level legal response. We actually had a hearing in the European Parliament on that, which was extremely interesting, and I won't say more. So what are we talking about in genetics? Obviously, it's a very complex field. It isn't just your genetic predisposition that's in play. It's how your body is configured to express those genetic predispositions. And that's why I'm just using this picture of knobs, right? You turn one knob down, perhaps one gene is not really expressed, it's at a whisper. You turn another knob up, another gene is very much expressed, like your predisposition to a higher level of cognitive ability, or your predisposition toward depression. You turn it down. Most of us would turn it down. Some of us would turn it up if you want to be a successful poet, okay? Sorry, I'm just using that as an example. And the thing is, they now have the genetic editing know-how to do this, at least to a certain extent. It's no guarantee that you will manifest according to the plan that you wish, but at least there's a fighting chance that if they can accentuate one genetic predisposition, other things being equal, which is a big assumption, then maybe you'll actually present as a much brighter kid in class. So of course, naturally you'd want to genetically edit your babies. And the interesting thing is, it's not just designer babies that are in play, because you can do it at any moment in your life. And so you say, oh God damn it, I'm really not optimistic enough. Let's say the gene for optimism was found. I really want that amplified and turned up. You can do it. Whether it's successful or not is another day's story. It's entirely possible. So we're dealing with the very stuff of what it is to be a person and a human being. And we're not just fixing things, we're kind of altering things. Okay, we're altering them within a given set of genes, but nevertheless the alteration might produce stark results. So the individual presents one day in one perspective, and then you meet the same individual the next day and they're a completely different personality, and so on and so forth. So, of course, you want students who will give you their essays or give you their research and share and cooperate. And it'd be great if we could somehow genetically edit everybody so that you suddenly become really sharing students rather than competitive and so forth. So it is possible, and it's becoming more possible. This is where BESS brings in the wild cards. The nanotechnology stuff is huge dollars being put into this, partly because it offers the prospect of personalized medication, personalized medicine, that instead of crude cures, like for example in cancer, chemotherapy, where we kind of indiscriminately kill good cells as well as bad cells and cause a lot of buildup of toxicity in the body, that we're now able to have a delivery device that goes right to where the cancer cells are, that targets only those cancer cells and eliminates those cancer cells without rising levels of toxicity in the body. So personalized medicine is now a huge field in its own right, and it's building off the actuality and the potentiality of nanotechnology. You've seen that what happens is a nano device, and it is artificially created, will be attractive to, let's say, the cancer cells. They will disproportionately lodge onto the cancer cells, and then once they do so, there will be a trigger device that releases the whatever the medicine is to attack the cancer cells. The problem that they're still working on, which makes them hesitate a bit about the technology, is that the nano devices tend to replicate themselves or cause chain reactions that might be uncontrollable. So what they're really trying to do is keep it within a narrow range, work with precision, try and ensure that the devices don't become rogue devices and begin devouring other aspects of your body and so forth. This is the one that's causing a lot of scares around the country, the world at the moment. Was it Stephen Hawking in Cambridge who came out recently and warned people like the robots are going to take over our lives, which hasn't proven to be true. I mean, movies like iRobot are just fantastic, but they're kind of a ways off. And I think Bess points out that some of the things we thought that robots could do quite easily, they find extremely difficult, and some of the things they find very difficult, they could do very easily. Of course, I mean, there's an element in Bess's book about over time, what are we going to do about employment for you guys, for ordinary people? Well, actually, he says you guys will still have a role because of the creative imagination required in lawyering and making arguments. Now, but I forgot to put on my slides a website that's under evolution, obviously in the United States. And the website's fascinating because it builds on artificial intelligence, and it's a legal website. So you have a particular question like, given comparative law, what is the best opinion about the right of access to a spiritual place for people, and how can that be phrased and framed and so forth? It will do all of the searching of the precedents for you. It will do all of the searching of the comparative law, the comparative legislation, and any international law that's out there. And it won't spit out unmitigated dog's dinner of information. It will give you a legal opinion. Fascinating. So watch out. Unless you specialize in this area, you might not have a job. I should give you that website because it's one to watch. And what they're doing now is they're asking people to register for it, to become part of the beta users, which I find quite fascinating because there's a lot of legal issues I'd like resolved. And the really scary one is synthetic biology. That we've been dealing so far with carbon units, right? We've been dealing so far with regular biology as we know it. But in actual fact, it's now possible to build biological units de novo without taking from other biological entities. So it's something that's evolving. It's something that shows, could I say, great promise in terms of creating beings, or at least microbes, that can handle a lot of stuff for us. For example, send them all out to clear up the air pollution over Hyderabad, or send them all out to clear up pollution after an oil tanker spills its crude oil and stuff like that. But again, there are problems over how you control it. How do you control the urge? Is there an urge that you can't avoid of these synthetic biological units replicating themselves, and before you know it, they've taken over the planet or something like that? But huge dollars are being put into this. A lot of money, both public and private money, has been put into this. Maybe one application of it in the purely medical field would be, can we create a kidney and then simply transplant it rather than waiting for an accident or a victim of an accident and a donation? And can we have them off the shelf so that if you yourself, your kidney degrades, that no problem, we'll just find a fit and you purchase it. Of course, the key here is you purchase it, right? And all of these technologies are available to whoever has the means to purchase them, as against to need alone, okay? And that's one thing that is going to be so disruptive if it's not controlled for in public policy and I guess in law in the years to come. Okay, so I showed you this before, but it's no harm showing you again. This is the website of the advocacy group called Humanity Plus, okay? And this is not a government body. This is not even a scientific body, and it's not a body of an international organization. It's just a bunch of like-interested enthusiasts who've come together to, first of all, propagate the technology, make sure people are aware of it, and to advocate that whatever barriers you think should be placed in the way, you're wrong. There should be no barriers, and it should run ahead apace. So this is called Humanity Plus. If you go in under any of the headings here, you'll find a lot of material. One thing they did put together, and I'll show it to you now, and you'll find it on their website, is the what they call the Transhumanist Declaration. Again, this is not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has no legal status as such, but it's their kind of their mantra, their Bible. Humanity will be radically changed by technology in the future. We foresee the feasibility of redesigning the human condition. So it's not just about fixing particular things, right? Oh my God, my memory is so bad, could I get it fixed? It's really about transcending it by maybe a factor of 100 into the future. Research should be put into understanding these developments and their long-term consequences. Well, the research is certainly there, but the long-term consequences research is not there at the moment. Transhumanists think by being generally open and embracing of new technology, we have a better chance of turning it to our advantage than if we tried to ban or prohibit it. Kind of free market ideology. The magic hand of the market will work itself pure over time. Trust us. Trust the market, okay? I don't know about you, but I never trust markets. Except the spice market in Hyderabad. I love that. Transhumanists advocate the moral right for those who wish to use technology to extend their mental and physical capacities. I don't know what the reference to reproductive capacities is here, and to improve control over their own lives. We seek personal growth beyond our current biological limitations. That's putting it to you, right? In planning for the future, it's mandatory to take into account the prospect of dramatic progress in technological capabilities. It would be tragic if technophobia and unnecessary prohibitions got in the way. So, kind of getting back to Darwin, this is the way it's going to evolve. It's just that we can now pull a trigger to make it evolve faster. So what's your problem, right? You believe in God, you're old-fashioned. It doesn't matter anymore. You believe in moral ethics? Well, heck, the sociobiologists have told you that ethics is just genetics in a sort of circuitous, roundabout way. And therefore, if you acknowledge that, then there ought to be no insuperable barrier to embracing the technology and moving it forward. We need to create forums where people can rationally debate what needs to be done, and a social order where responsible decisions can be implemented. This is the interesting one right at the end. Transhumanism advocates the well-being of all sentience. Okay? So they're taking sides in that debate we've been having about what's the key indicator of being a human, what's the key indicator of being a person. It's not really cognition, although cognitive ability is one of the big beneficiaries of this. It's really just sentience. And they're broad-minded enough to apply to artificial intellects, humans, post-humans, or non-human animals. Okay, that just kind of begs the question, what is a non-human animal? Sorry. Yeah, I guess what they're really trying to get at there is that some animals are like humans, they are persons, and they too should be able to benefit. So if whales could be upgraded to be able to speak their mind or something like that, or if my dog could be upgraded, that would be a fantastic thing. I'm not so sure. So that's their credo, if you will. So I just want to put this on the table and then open it up for a debate and maybe show a little bit of the video on eugenics. The pro-enhancement arguments, there's a lot of them. One argument is that, gosh, we have it within our wherewithal, not only to fix problems, but to create a better future. Why wouldn't you use that, right? If you could be happy all the time, wouldn't that be a great thing? I'm not so sure. So, secondly, there's no fixed core of characteristics that make us human. We can reinvent ourselves. So that's why they go to the very, 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 very base indicator of what it means to be a person and a human, which is just sentience, right? We can do natural selection and evolution. We can make it work better, quicker, and smarter. So it fits with our evolution thus far. It's just that we have the wherewithal to accelerate it, and maybe accelerate it in directions that we don't know where it's going to lead, but neither do we know where natural selection is going to lead. I mean, our big problem is our evolution concretized, maybe, I don't know, the last 50 or 60,000 years, when life is so different. But actually our lives and our life circumstances have utterly transformed only in the last 100 years, which is a speck in the eye of evolution. So if we don't change ourselves now, we're fated to live very miserable lives. We might adjust in 2,000, 10,000 years, but that's too late for most of us, okay? That's assuming, of course, that human rights are the priority. You might take the Darwinian view that no, it's the genetics that's the priority, not the actual humans themselves. Anyway, that's the argument. We have an obligation to do so coming from our commitment to humanity and human flourishing. So if you're really, really humanitarian, you can imagine Mahatma Gandhi here today, right, saying, our future in India is transhumanism, let's go for it. If you're really interested in humanity, this is what you should be doing. It should be your natural reflex. And throwing a spanner into the pot, pursuing our infinite potential is what gives our lives meaning. So, well, you can kind of see that from a World Bank point of view. Human development is all about releasing human potential, creating conditions for the expression of human potential. But you can see where it leads at the same time. So there are the arguments, and there are more, in favor of unrestricted, unregulated growth of these industrial sectors to allow for new applications in the future. So that in 5 years' time, when I come back to teach in GIAN, I'll be a completely different person. What are the arguments against? One of them is that limits, far from being something that is devastating to our identity, make us who we are. They're constitutive of our identity. What matters so much is not so much the limits you happen to inherit or were born into, but how you deal with them. And that's what brings out your character. And the limits themselves are of no ethical moment. It's how you yourself respond to them and evolve and grow as a human being. That's what's important. You can see some of these arguments tinged with religion. We'll come back to that momentarily. Humans are playing God and should not do so. That's exactly the title of Yuval Harari's second book, Homo Deus, the God-man. We are now our own gods. We will create life into the future, and we will transform our own lives into the future. Why can't we play God? If we have the chance to do so, why shouldn't we do so? The ancient Greeks didn't believe that, but that's another day's story. Another argument is we will evolve anyhow, and let's just allow evolution take its course. Problem with that, of course, is that we're demonstrably ill-suited in terms of genetic makeup to the kind of society, economy, and polity that's actually accrued over the last 100 years. So something's got to give. At least that would be the argument. Fourth, we can't predict where modifications, enhancements will get out of control. That's absolutely true. Sometimes in science and in regulatory science, they use a counsel of prudence. If you're not really sure, then you should err on the side of caution and don't do it. And most scientists actually adopt the counsel of prudence. The problem is some don't. You've seen in unregulated environments, like in Mexico, for example, doctors created maybe is too strong a word, a new person, a baby, by using the genetic material of 3 people and not 2 people, with somewhat unpredictable consequences. We don't know yet what they might turn out to be. However, if that argument were used against every innovation in society, then there would be a huge break on any change. So you've got to balance that into the thing as well. We risk subverting what makes us human, but the whole point of the transhumanists is there is no essence to what makes us human, it's just sentience. There's no God-given characteristic that's cemented into place forever. And therefore, we should feel latitude enough to be able to go about playing around with all of these characteristics, messing them up, seeing what comes out the other end, and so forth. Then the argument is we risk subverting human dignity through the commodification of the person. Now that's very cogent, because think of it this way. First of all, the people who have access, at least in the short term, to the technology, they're only going to be the upper strata of society, those who can afford it, right? So that there's that element of commodification in the market. The other element of commodification is the person becomes the sum total of the enhancements and the technologies that are inputted into him or her, right? Leading to all sorts of interesting legal questions, like in product liability law, what if something goes wrong? If the product becomes part of who I am, is it any longer a thing that can be litigated over? Because if you are, you're in a strange way saying that the person isn't a person, it's a piece of property. So you can just imagine all of the legal issues that's around that, okay? And the last is pretty obvious, that we're going to return to feudalism. We're going to return to very variegated degrees of citizenship, of inclusion and exclusion. And it will be all objectively ordered. And that's why a lot of the theorists said the first casualty of transhumanism will be a commitment to human equality. That will be gone by the board, because it will be transparently untrue that we're all equal as persons. So, where are we? Sorry, say that again? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Fordism, pre-Fordism, post-Fordism. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see we have a dog. Maybe we can enhance the dog. Sorry. Okay, let me throw it open and see what you think, particularly of those arguments. Let me go back to it. The pro-arguments. What we'll do tomorrow is we'll look at the Council of Europe instruments, the legal instruments, really just to explore where the gaps are in law and how the existing legal instruments really don't reach these kind of issues. There's a study on the Council of Europe website, and I've actually listed it in the material for the class tomorrow. Let me just move on quickly. This is the Council of Europe Bioethics website. Council of Europe is very easy to find on the web. You just do coe.int for International Organization. And within human rights, see human rights up here, you'll find a heading called bioethics, and it brings you to this bioethics page. So here you'll see headings like emerging technologies. What they're really getting at here is transhumanism, right? And they've only in the last 2 years begun looking at these issues. So you'll find about 4 or 5 reports on this in there. And the first is by 2 Swedish academics. That's the one I want you to try and look at for tomorrow if you can. Because what it does is it reveals the lacuna or the gaps in the legal order to begin addressing these kinds of issues. I also gave you 5 or 6 legal instruments, treaties. They're not very long. You can skim through them pretty quickly, and you can see where the center of gravity of them are. Probably the one that's most closely regulated, at least at European level, is genetic editing, genetic manipulation, and one of the Council of Europe instruments is the only one in the world to legally prohibit human cloning. But there are no other instruments in the world that does that. Anyhow, let me go back to the... Oh, and by the way, they've had 2 or 3 major conferences on this issue, and all of the presentations are in video form, so you can watch all of the proceedings online if you're minded to do that. Let me go back. Who would argue the toss of pro-enhancement? The dog. I need to be able to communicate to my master. I want that bone now. I often have that conversation with my dog when he's snapping my heels, demanding water or food. I say, don't you understand the idea of just waiting for a minute? No, he doesn't. So where do you find yourself in this mix of arguments?
I would just extend on the last argument. If you're saying pursuing that intervention is what gives our life change. I'll just tie this back to some of the earlier discussions we had on what it means to be human, more in terms of the entitlement to make mistakes and to learn from them. So I would just look at that expression and extend it further, saying that apart from pursuing our infinite potential, we also have the sort of entitlement to make mistakes as we pursue our potential. And in that sense, if experimentation can create beneficial consequences in the long run, there could be short-term costs, such as those of commodification or those of enhancements themselves creating inequalities in the short run. Because if you look at essentially technology which is applied in other domains also, like those concerns predate the current discussion on human enhancements as well. When you first built the modern train or the modern steel mill, even that would have certainly undermined equality as it was understood from a previous order. So pursuing your potential could certainly include experimentation, risk-taking, but then also overcoming the problems that you come across while pursuing, while on that long-term objective. So I just developed that argument a little bit more.
But if I could avoid making mistakes, wouldn't you want to do that? No? What's the point of learning if you can bypass all of that and just do the right thing? Yeah? Yeah.
we can also end up making mistakes of the kind which are offered as objections.
I'm sure we make a lot of mistakes. I mean, that's one of the interesting thing about science is there is this scientific method and urge toward objectivity, but in truth all scientific information is provisional. It changes through time. If you ever read Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, you'll get to understand that. In fact, one of the most famous nuclear scientists at the beginning of the nuclear age, and I'm talking about 1910, 1914, was coming up with all sorts of new theories and finding no receptivity to them within the scientific community. And he famously said, the best way for a new scientific theory to get accepted is if the champions of the old scientific theory die away. That people become really, convinced of the objectivity of their approach. And it's really, really hard for them to climb down from one mountain and climb up another mountain. So the provisional nature of scientific knowledge maybe should be in and of itself a counsel for prudence for allowing the technology to evolve unregulated. What does this side of the house think?
So that's also for other institutional practices,
Yeah.
not just for bioenhancement. So even when we talk about the evolution of social or political institutions, I mean the same idea applies, right? That you are going to try and work out a possible solution to a problem that we see in the short run. In the long run, the way we re-examine the same problem may come from, I mean, the analysis may come from a very different lens.
Yeah.
And a different solution may be considered to be the right solution. So in that sense, it's true for all
Yeah.
not just science.
Sure. Leaving that to one side for the moment, right? Let's say there was an element of objectivity, or at least enough objectivity to give you confidence that what they're aiming for they can actually achieve. If they achieved it, and if the person's, let's say, cognitive abilities were enhanced by a factor of 100, is that person still a person? What is it? Is that dog still a dog? What do you think? I'm the minister, I need an answer. You're the expert.
Gone through a bit of this, and I think what the author out here, what he was trying to say is, when you talk about transhumanism, you shouldn't just look at it as just one person being enhanced. So if everyone is going to be enhanced, then I think there wouldn't be an issue of whether, then all of us can still be persons, because all of us have come on par with each one. So I think he was talking about the Jetsons fallacy. So in that way, I don't think the issue comes as to who is a person, because all of us would be enhanced. And it's as in if we had to look at transhumanism, he said let's not look at it as something that only one person is enhanced. So it should be the population on whole. So then that should not be.
But isn't it likely that only some people will be enhanced to suit, for example, public policy purposes, to have better soldiers, to have better engineers, to have better doctors, and then the others will be enhanced if they can afford it, leaving the vast majority of the population unenhanced? For example, enhancement is already taking place in sport. To a certain extent, it's perfectly logical that athletes would want to enhance their capacities by taking X, Y, and Z drug. By the way, I'm not defending it, but it's an entirely predictable, logical development within that domain. So why are we getting hung up about it? As Bess says, why don't we create Olympics for the super enhanced and Olympics for the unmodified? Do you want to? Did you want to say something? Oh no, you just had your hand like that. Sorry. Yeah.
That's where the issue of talent becomes raised. Because that's when people would oppose, because what if you want to be enhanced and you don't have probably I think it goes more on the demand and supply, and also you need to have the means to reach that. So there would be this issue of haves and have-nots.
So, take education, for example. We see education as a way of imparting marketable skills, as a tool for citizenship in a democracy, as a tool to inculcate values of tolerance and empathy and compassion toward different peoples. Why would you need that anymore? You know? In a dystopic transhumanist society. In terms of marketable skills, job done. We have the transhumans. Of course, the thing is, could we look at it the other way around? That we, the unenhanced, would use them as our slaves to do everything that needs to be done, and then we'll have a jolly nice time just living off their work product? Or is it more likely that it would be the other way around, that they would be able to command entities to perform everything that needs to be done, and they will benefit and we will be left out? Which way around is it?
About this machine, an AI interface that's only purpose was to calculate pi, and in doing so it ends up thinking that all other tasks are not as sacred or as important as its task of calculating pi, and this machine may then end up drawing energy from other sources that could have been used for other purposes to do what it believes is supposed to be the supreme task to be completed. I don't know how that works, but he believes that's a concern that we should keep in mind when we're looking at these sort of creations. And another thing is now ethical considerations that possibly people debated only in, say, a philosophy class would become more important in real life applications. So the self-driving cars, for example, and this is another example that he gave, you'll now have a car that will have to make the decision of whether it should put the brakes and save one person on the road or swerve and kill its passenger instead. And that's something a person driving the car may have been able to do, but how are you going to program such decision making into a machine? So those are problems that will still crop up even when you're looking at bio-enhanced machines, right?
Maybe you just program in the algorithm from Jeremy Bentham, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and make the driverless car decide accordingly. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest issues with any bio-enhancement is, much like any other technology, the first application of this technology is going to be military. So all this concept of super soldiers, which Hollywood has willingly picked up, might as well translate into reality. And legally speaking also, there might be other issues of your intellectual property involved. You gave one example of product liability. There could be issues of intellectual property involved. Who owns the patent over a human being who has been technologically enhanced? So that also could be an issue. Another legal issue I see is probably will come from your argument of environment law about your precautionary principle. Should we engage in such an activity in a technology whose implications over the future environment, over future is completely unknown and unforeseeable? So I think these are some of the legal problems that can arise.
So, but what do we think about the argument that we're playing God? Does that work for you? Do you subscribe to it? You're saying that
we have been playing God since quite a while, so that see, in fact, we are in an age in which I think anthropologists have declared this age as Anthropocene. We are no longer in the Holocene period, so we have already interfered in nature and earth so much that we have entered into a new age where the nature is being shaped by humans. So I think more than the argument of humans playing God, I think a better sort of argument is coming from the argument of human dignity and equality, which has been raised.
I'd like to hear more about the argument from Dignity. We'll come back.
More than the human dignity argument, the problem with biosynthesis is a very risks associated with the process. About what if you end up inventing something that's going to destroy mankind? That sort of argument, I think, is more compelling, at least right now. Because the question of dignity and equality and commodification is something that will be addressed at a later stage, in which we're kind of assuming sort of society where such practices are prevalent. So I think the precautionary approach that he was talking about at this moment in time seems more sensible and relevant to.
Exactly, yeah. I actually had to get my teenage daughter to explain the movie to me. But we have a big dispute between the United States and Europe. They allow for genetically modified crops, and basically the genetic modification is quite modest. It's simply to genetically modify the crops to excrete a certain chemical that insects do not find very appetizing. So therefore they don't destroy the crop. But because of the precautionary principle, Council of Prudence, European Union refuses to import genetically modified crops, which is a big dispute before the World Trade Organization at the moment. But it's because we're taking the precautionary route in Europe. Well, it's kind of hard to see how that could transmogrify itself to something exceptionally dangerous to human beings. So it's a little bit like an impulsive response rather than a rational response. At least that's what the Americans say. But if you've tasted American bread, I mean, it all tastes the same. So it's not producing very good food.
A couple of years ago, we had this IPR project, so whether a higher life form should be patented or not. So it talks about various legislations, how like single-celled organisms or single-cell organisms can be easily controlled. But when it comes to higher life forms, you cannot control higher life forms which are multi-celled organisms. You can very well control single-cell mutations. So talking about crops, it's just a single-cell mutation. You can very actually control it. But when it comes to multi-celled organism, you don't know how it's going to react. So there was an argument whether higher life forms should be patented or not. So it's just lower life.
But that's probably going to evolve into the future. Yeah. And you probably noticed about 2 or 3 years ago there was a major US Supreme Court decision that regarding patentability of human life forms. And they interestingly unanimously rejected it, which is it's very rare in the US Supreme. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anybody else? What about the dignity argument? Oh, sorry, yeah.
I think whatever technologies we have now, so whatever input we put inside the technologies is usually decided by us. That means we are ethically and morally thinking to take the decisions. So if we can enhance the humans and develop that technique, even that machine inherently can think ethically and morally and take decisions accordingly, then enhancement won't create any problem in future, I guess. I think that machine will itself, whatever enhancement we have done it, that it will take decisions morally and it will think ethically. So I think in future enhancement will not create any problems.
But why won't it create problems? Because it's making correct decisions?
Yes, because it will think morally and ethically. Then as we are thinking right now, the machines will think in a similar way, and then it won't create any problems.
Yeah.
So there's no problem in enhancing.
Unless you turn off the moral thinking apparatus and it just begins thinking like a robot.
Talking about over here is on the genetic pool. It's on the genome structures, right? So we are saying this enhancement via pharma or via genetic engineering or through electronics is going to alter the gene. Somehow we are playing a lot of cards on the nature component
earlier in this class we were talking about a nature and the nurture component. The genome type, the phenome type and the epitype. Now we are doing a lot of stuff on the genome type, on the gene type. What are we doing with the phenome type and what's happening to the epitype is something that I'm not able to predict. I'm not able to predict. So I'm wondering what we are talking about. What we're talking about is one component. What's happening to the nurture component of the creation of the self and the manifestation of the self. That's something I'm yet to understand.
So they reckon only 40%, you have a 40% chance that a gene that is expressing itself in terms of high cognitive capacity will actually impact on you as a person, because it depends on a lot of other considerations as well. I guess, and I'm just hypothesizing here, that the people who will be using this will already be from higher socioeconomic status. Probably the environment in which they grow up is amenable, susceptible to the expression of that, which is a self-perpetuating cycle, right, of the higher capacity beings replicating themselves. It's interesting that far from reducing disparities or inequalities amongst groups, that it becomes successful according as we accept those socioeconomic divisions, and then it takes off in one group, and before you know it, that group is leaping ahead of the rest in society. That's one of the concerns. What about the market? Are you troubled by market dynamics in here? The fact that it's major multinational companies that are investing? Does that trouble you, or do you just see a new market evolving, and if you can access it, okay, but if others can't, so what? Yeah. Yeah. Eventually. Possibly. Well, there are also, you could imagine packages off the shelf, titanium package, really super duper cognitive ability, or silver package, medium level cognitive ability.
Of course, it's probably already ancient for the students, but for someone who remembers not using mobile phones like 15 years ago, like this is a wonderful extension of the self, right? You can maintain records, you can talk to people in other parts of the world, you can store photographs, you can schedule, and the way in which the technology has expanded in the last 10-15 years has actually made it accessible. I mean, to the extent that most Indians will first surf the internet on a smartphone rather than a laptop or a desktop. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if some firms take the lead in essentially pushing that research initially in the initial years, because eventually the enhancement could become accessible. I mean, of course, you have to do a good job of regulating the market, but if the product itself has such a scale, then certainly the question of access can also be addressed within the market structure. So.
Actually perplexing, because I'm referring to this one particular place that I'm aware of. It's a hospital in the city of Chennai, and in the year 2008, when we got my mom undergo a knee replacement surgery, it was done by a doctor. I know it was done by a team of doctors, and it was a doctor who was actually hammering through the bone that had to be removed, so that an implant which will work like the knee could be placed. Now in 2014, when we got the other knee replaced, we were told that it was a robotic, that the surgery which earlier took 5 hours will now take around 1 hour and 30 minutes, 1.5 hours. And this is partly because the major part of the surgery would be done by a robo, and a lot of it would be removed, the bone part would be removed. Okay, now if a robo is coming in, so the first query that we had was, is it safe? 1. 2, and the doctor explained that the chances that the robo would go wrong would be less than the chances that a man could harm. Fine, that part was fine. Now if a robo is coming in and it's going to do the chipping part, wherein the actual surgeon will drill and fix the implant. So that's the crucial part. Fine. So if a technology comes in for the sake of enhancement, there's also this market business that we're talking about and profit-making business that we're talking about. And we know that in India, a lot of these surgeries do happen with big corporate hospitals which can manage to take this kind of technology in, then the price should be lowered. And we find that the second surgery actually escalated our budget by 3 times. So this is a concern that over a period, and these surgeries which came into, I mean, we are aware of it, let's say in the past 5 years, have already been done elsewhere. So it's not that the latest is going to come into our markets, right? Again, that's... No, but we are already 6 years late. That way, what was available in UK by 2009 came into India in 2014, and it's still very pricey.
It's because it's because the technology is patented by some company, so that's why it's costly now. But over the time, it become mainstream, and everyone will be enjoying that.
So it's enhancement only for certain category of people who can afford. Remember, you said enhancement and for development and for equity. All those big words kept throwing you. They didn't come into our world in the past couple of years.
So I mean, the cell phone is a good example though, because it's almost part of who you are now. I mean, it's almost, we've merged man and machine already. I mean, the examples Bess was giving was about, you know, you interacting with your car, with your foot on the pedal, you don't even think anymore. It's part of who you are. And he actually made the point that the commingling of man and machine, literally through nanotechnology, will alter our sense of selfhood, which is why I'm asking the question, is it any more a person?
About the market dynamics of introducing something like this, can't we compare it to, say, the pharmaceutical industry, where today you have patented drugs that cost a lot, and if the government feels that these drugs should be more accessible, or say there's a particular disease or something of some sort somewhere, then you do have mechanisms like compulsory licensing that make sure there are generic versions of it available at cheaper costs. So if there is an obvious inequality that can be seen, then the government can regulate it through similar mechanisms, right? So that shouldn't be too big.
So we can handle the egregious disparities in the marketplace by some basic governmental program of redistribution, but it will never actually bring you up to the level of those who, like Donald Trump, can afford the most expensive technology. So long as people are reasonably happy that they're able to augment themselves in a way that suit themselves, that's okay. So if you're not part of the super group, but you can be happy nonetheless, that's okay. Haven't heard from you guys? You've no moral problems, no legal problems with enhancement?
I'm not so sure why we are being so skeptical about market solutions. Like in 200 years from now, I mean, we can actually buy artificial limbs that can be used for surgery straight away on the open market. Why not? What's the problem with that? I mean, we are realistic market to buy a limb.
Yeah, well, the way to drive technology is to allow for an open market and allow people to invest and gain a return. Absolutely. But that doesn't preclude rogue operators in the market. So it begs the question about how do you structure that market, what's the appropriate level of regulation, and then even when the market produces predictably uneven results, how do you compensate for that?
Also about the market that the airlines example that Bess gives, or how instead of flying supersonic jets, because of the demand for airline, the industry has come to a point where the prices have gone down and made travel affordable to everybody. So we could think of a similar situation where instead of near constant expansion in technology, it could still at a rate, at a standard where the market demands a particular form of technology. Exactly.
Yeah, but what implication do you draw from that? What are the implications from that?
Somehow the fear that there will be a disparity between the haves and the have-nots which will be created by technology, that could probably be stilled at a point where market demand inhibits further innovation. But the problem with that is that does not, it's not going to do anything to erase the inequality which already exists. So for that we have to continue to make policies the way we do, or perhaps taking into account the new socio-economic conditions, but that's something that will not go away. At least that's what.
Since we're talking about the market demand, it also depends on the kind of business model the company wants to adopt. For example, if you look at the model that Tesla is going ahead with, it all depends on the kind of research and the kind of, again with Tesla they have an open patent policy. So research sharing in terms of the kind of technology that you want to put out would also make a difference in the kind of policy that you adopt.
And yeah,
This is just sort of thinking out loud, but in law right now you have the criteria of a reasonable man. Suppose you enhance your cognitive ability so far that are you going to have different laws that apply to you because you're going to be held to a different standard than the reasonable man? Or are you going to stop some person who has enhanced their face from participating in a beauty contest? So, like, what are the changes, legal changes that you're going to see? Are you going to separate these two people or sort of try and put them together and go on?
so are you anticipating you expect different standards of behavior from different gradations of enhanced people? How would the legal system react to it? Yeah. That's a little bit like the debate in the UK about whether the common law should apply all the time or whether on some occasions the Sharia should apply to some, which, I mean, it's not an apt analogy, but it's a problem we're facing. Anything else? Any other arguments? Again, in terms of criteria of personhood, again, taking the person that's begging the question, that's enhanced by a factor of 100 in terms of cognitive ability. I hear some of you saying, no problem, that person's still a person. But does it become a super person? Do we imagine then gradations of citizenship, first-class citizenship, second-class citizenship? Does it not make some logical sense? I know in India it doesn't because you're so democratic, but in other countries.
That something like this doesn't shock us. Like, we are so used to the caste system that, okay, the possibility of alpha, beta, and such classifications in the future are pretty accessible to us culturally. And I mean, the other way of putting it is that if you, I mean, of course, law school is a slightly different profile of people you get to interact with. But if you ask the average middle-class Indian and ask them to take a skeptical attitude towards science, what you'll find is that maybe we are compensating for our unwillingness to engage with science historically. Like, if you see the sort of middle-class opinion that our children should become engineers or should study science, of course, not enough Indians are doing pure science, but at least there's this understanding that looking at the applied disciplines will at least help you with upward mobility, it will help you become a better person. A lot of it, I think, is also historical anxiety, because if you look at the period leading up to late colonialism, the Indians have historically been very suspicious of science. And what you are now seeing in the post-independence period is a new emerging middle class, which is perhaps compensating for that anxiety in the long run. And there's a lot of work in the field of psychoanalysis, which has made this argument very clearly. So I mean, I can share those books with you, but there are writers like Sudhir Kakkad or Ashish Nandi, who've basically written a lot about the clash between tradition and modernity in India. And they've linked it to this experience of colonial rule, that what we saw in the other is something that we thought we lacked. So we're now trying to build a nation state which will possibly go further. So which is why if you run the same course with a different group of people in India, you may come across a much sharper position in favor of enhancements.
So there's no chance that transhumans could become a scheduled caste in India or something like that? No. Different character, okay, I get it. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So we're grouping everything as bio-enhancements, and would they become superhumans? But there are obviously certain kinds of enhancements that would still allow you to maintain your personality and your personhood. Some wouldn't. So if you've had a cosmetic enhancement done to you, you're still allowed to participate in a beauty contest, right? So, and if I take a lot of Red Bull and walk into my exam tomorrow, I'm still allowed to write the exam. And these enhancements are only helping me do what Red Bull did to a smaller degree now. So those sort of things shouldn't take away from your personhood or somehow make you better off or worse off than others. But then maybe something like AI or something is something where we deliberate this a little better.
What about you mess about with your emotions, right? What about if you become enhanced to the point that you're happy all the time? Whereas in fact most of us you're happy all the time. You don't need the enhancement. Someone else might. Is there an issue there? You're distorting and exaggerating and optimizing a trait that for most of us is part of a bunch of traits, but now you're putting it front and center.
I have a right to make myself feel happier as well. I mean, if I want to be the kind of person who has a happy disposition, today maybe I would go see a counselor if I'm upset or depressed or sad. Instead of going to a counselor, in 10 years down the line, I'll just pop a pill. It's coming down to the same thing, isn't it, in a way? Different in potency and degree, but in terms of what is happening to you, it's the same thing. You're making yourself, or you're attempting to make yourself feel happier. And there's this example of a particular professor in the reading who has been taking a pill to make himself feel better, feel happier, feel less worry, but what he found was in the process he was losing his memory. So he decided not to make the trade-off because his memory was important to him. So that's a call that each individual can make for themselves, what they value more. And your personhood is still being respected because you're making a choice for yourself, whether you value A emotion better or B emotion, or whether you value, yeah.
But could you say that if you, there's a difference of degree, let's say, in doing the normal things to make yourself happy, to correct for unhappy tendencies, vis-a-vis organically changing your, let's say, genetic makeup. And if you do that, and you're a very happy person, as we hope you are, and then in the future you make certain decisions, is the you that's making those decisions a different you than the person who made the decisions in the past? Has it changed your complexion as a self, as a person? Or would you say, yes, but that's a result of my choice? But then if the more happier you makes a certain set of choices, it's not the original you making the choices.
It's actually a great question. I had another thought. How do you distinguish this situation from prescription drugs that are prescribed to you to make you feel certain emotions better or worse? Or your psychiatrist prescribing you medication for, say, depression or something like that. You're still, it's a prescriptive drug, but you're still taking the drug, aren't you?
Okay.
I don't think the question of personhood should change on basis of how the enhanced person may deviate from their standard understanding of human behavior or traits, because at some level should the human person get some extra citizenship right or become a super citizen. Because at some level, in terms of political rights, they should all be equal regardless of whether the human is enhanced or not. But yes, in terms of say if the person is say enhanced beyond a certain degree, maybe it's unfair for that person to participate in, so you probably would not, it probably would not be a great idea to let an enhanced person participating in normal Olympics. But that does not mean that the person should not have a right to vote, or the person should not have the normal freedom to speech and other political, civil, economic rights. That's what I would say about personhood of a person, of an enhanced person. And I think at some level also what she is saying that this bio-enhancement should not be seen as like one single category. But there are all different forms of innovations happening all around us. It can happen through pills, it can happen through bio-enhancement, it could happen through something like say wearables, something that you wear which gives you extra in cognitive abilities or extra memories abilities or something like that. It can happen in different ways, but on basis of that, person's rights and citizenship should not, and personhood should not be affected.
Do you think a person, I don't think this would ever happen, okay? But do you think a person, just building on this notion of you made the choice, so, and it's not really a distinction of kind, it's just a distinction of degree, right? Do you think a person has the choice to shut off those things that you consider to be the essence of what a human is? So let's say, for the sake of example, I say, oh, enough of looking at myself in the mirror. I would like my self-consciousness decreased because I'm too self-conscious or something like that. Or I'm fed up being the smartest one in the class, I just want to be like everybody else. Do you think I have the right to do that? Almost to the point of eliminating those traits that some of us at least have considered to be the essence of what it means to be human?
You are asking if in case a person's got ability to do that, should they be allowed to do so? I think it should, but I don't see like how would this affect the person, their personhood, or the question of their rights.
I think the question that's not being addressed at all is at what point do you stop considering them as human? So already the question of what is human is debatable. So at what point do you say that somebody stops being human, and whether those non-humans or transhumans are part of human society, or whether the structure of society has changed to accommodate them, or perhaps separate them from human society. So depending on that, the new legal order and the basis on which rights and duties are allocated would depend on the new social structure.
It's not just that we're tweaking biology, it's that we're changing it. That's the point. And remember, it's only humans that can be person. Well, that's not quite true, because corporations can be persons too. But that does leave open the tantalizing possibility that there might be another category we create for these so-called persons or superhuman persons.
So Robocop essentially has some continuities or memories from the human being whose spine is transplanted into the body, but he seems to be the super efficient law and order enforcer. But he's constantly having this back and forth between images from his previous life as Alex something, what's the character, and the current sort of embodiment is essentially supposed to be an instrument that people can control in some cases. Sometimes he uses excessive force. So Robocop is kind of your best example right now, right?
That's Schwarzenegger, right? No? No? Okay. Oh, okay, yeah. I watch too many highbrow movies. I obviously don't watch the right ones. Yeah?
Whether we ascribe these